even though those of us working in the free library movement, we didn't say that we worked on privacy or data justice per se. These questions, right, of accessing the internet, of accessing books, of community spaces, of being in ownership of your information, your data, and having that information safeguarded, all of these have been a huge part of the very layered and difficult history of the library, of the modern institution of the library.
Welcome to the Everyday Podcast, where we talk about our relationship with technology and the role it plays in our day-to-day lives. From artificial intelligence to online dating and ride-sharing apps, this podcast invites past residents of our annual residency, the Digital Everyday, to look at our tech touchpoints through a feminist lens. My name is Yashita, and I'll be your host for this episode. The Digital Everyday is a 3-month digital-first learning journey about the entanglements between bodies, technologies, and social justice, in the hopes that this knowledge will empower key actors in building a safer, more equitable, and feminist internet. Feminist pedagogy forms the core principle of the course. Learning is shaped through co-creation, collaboration, care, and critique. This week, we have Zoya Chadha, who is a resident of the Digital Everyday in 2023, to share some of their experiences. Zoya Chadha is a researcher and library organizer based in New Delhi. Her work is located at the intersections of building access to literature, critical digital literacies, and library movement advocacy. She recently transitioned out of her role as Digital Equity and Media Coordinator at the Community Library Project in New Delhi, where she set up a digital community library as a multimedia space of reliable information, community experiences, and literature. She was a member of the Research and Action Group at the Free Libraries Network to develop the People's National Library Policy 2024, and she works with government and nonprofit organizations to develop courses, handbooks, and curriculum materials with a focus on critical literacies, digital technologies, and justice in educational spaces. Welcome, Zoya. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm so excited. Yeah.
How are you doing today, and where are you attending this call from?
I'm doing great, actually, and I'm taking this call from a friend's house. And this is a friend who's kind of been in my journey of thinking through a lot of the questions that we're actually going to discuss today. So that seems fitting.
That's amazing. I mean, libraries are such important spaces for learning and community. And for me personally, I was a huge reader growing up, and a lot of my childhood was spent at my local library in Calcutta. So I'm very interested in learning more about your journey, and I think that the work that you've been doing is so important. So how did it come about for you?
So in 2019, I was working as a researcher at a government institution, an educational researcher working in inclusion. And at the same time, I was volunteering at a free community library. And this is in 2019, near the end of 2019, when the CA-NRC protests began. And when I was at one of these protests in Shaheen Bagh, that's when I came across a library that we were trying to build in that protest space. And I began going to that library regularly, that protest library, right? And I started organizing to kind of collect material for that library. And I began going there myself to do regular read alouds in that space. And so there was a point of time where I would go to work in the morning, and in my lunch break, I'd actually go to the free community library, borrow books, and at the end of my shift, I would take the metro to Shaheen Bagh, to the protest library there, and do read alouds until, the end of the night when we packed up. And I think that was really key to understanding how I could use my education in literature so far. Because I think the years of studying BA and in English, I was always really concerned with this question of the use or the power of literature.
Right.
And I think in library spaces, I was able to see that really come alive and how crucial it was to have access not only to literature, not only to books, but to collective reading spaces, right? And being able to see very clearly how reading is an act of protest, right? How reading is, particularly collective reading, how that's an affirmation, how that's a stance that you take to read in the face of violence, right? So that's when I became more greatly involved in this question. And I started working full time soon after when the pandemic began. That's when I began working full time in free library spaces and setting up a digital library and so on.
I really love how you frame collective reading as an act of resistance. That's really so powerful. I think reading is so important for us to develop the vocabulary to understand and speak about the world around us, to understand society, politics, power, and community. And I think that it can also be so powerful because it encourages us to imagine, to think differently, and, to reimagine how we want to be in and move through the world. What about for you? What does collective reading mean to you?
So I think I see a lot of power being negotiated in the act of collective reading, wherever, and particular as it takes place in libraries. I also think that the very fact of collective reading is that it challenges silence, right? It challenges how we construe the space of the library as a quiet space or an isolated space. So, in that way, it's really powerful. I think in the context of the course, I was able to make a lot of connections between collective reading that we did in the library and collective reading that we did in the digital everyday as well.
I'm curious, especially after what you've just shared about reading and learning as an act of resistance, of social justice in a way. What drew you to the digital everyday? Did you find similar themes coming up in the course? And where was the interest in technology coming from? Did you find the course to be relevant to your work and your practice?
So I actually learned of the digital everyday in 2022. And that's when the first edition had already began, right? So I saw an Instagram post and I read about it and I recognized it as a course that was exploring a lot of the ideas and the concerns that I had encountered in my practice as a librarian, as someone coordinating a digital community library. And at the time, I felt this gap, right? I felt this gap with those whom I was speaking to and whose work I was reading, who did research and other kinds of work on digital privacy and surveillance, right? And I knew, of course, that even though those of us working in the free library movement, we didn't say that we worked on privacy or data justice per se. These questions, right, of accessing the internet, of accessing books, of community spaces, of being in ownership of your information, your data, and having that information safeguarded, all of these have been a huge part of the very layered and difficult history of the library, of the modern institution of the library. So, of course, these things are very connected. But I was seeing a gap between the registers of talking of these issues. And so when I joined the digital everyday, I'd already been working for some years on building community spaces that interrogated and modeled digital access and critical digital literacy. I'd been working with community members to access online college admission systems, for example, to create digital media that tells our own stories, and advocating for a better internet as its co creators. And there were many questions that were, let alone being answered, they didn't seem to have a place in academic and research circles around technology and society. So I felt a great deal of distance from them, even though I knew that our work is very, very deeply connected at the core of it. And I joined the digital everyday the following year, hopeful that it would be a place where people were asking similar questions, right? And that the questions that I had in relation to my practice had a place. And I believe that possibly this could be a place where we were understanding the ways in which technology and activism and the body, all of these things are intertwined, and weaving that into the organizing and the education that I did. So to really answer it in a short way, I needed language. And I felt the need for language. A language that could address the oppressive designs of digital technologies. Language that could help advocate for and work towards just digital words, just words. So when I saw the call for the 2023 course, I hoped that I could begin to find that language and ask questions in a way that were relevant to my work in such a space. And I think TDE has done that.
That really resonates with me too. I think that building that critical language to be able to talk about tech in society is one of the key takeaways from the digital everyday. In my experience of participating in the course, I found that a lot of the concepts that were being talked about and explained, for example, about how algorithms work or how data is collected about us to then give us personalized ads, were things that I already knew about through experience, but I didn't exactly have the language to explain how and why it was happening. And it was good for me too that learning was happening through peers. I mean, there was a space for everyone to come together and share their experiences and then develop this common vocabulary. So, in the digital everyday, participants are divided into small groups or cohorts within which learning takes place. But instead of having a traditional system of a teacher imparting learnings with students as passive receptors, course participants volunteer to co facilitate and guide their peers through different topics and course materials. Zoya, what did you think of the co-facilitation method? What was your experience of it?
So I really, really enjoyed and appreciated the co-facilitation part of the whole course. And I co-facilitated the first learning call that we had in my cohort that took place after our introductory call. And I did the same for the final call that we had as a cohort. So first and last, which was really interesting because I could very clearly see the difference in terms of my preparation and also the difference in terms of the call itself. And the first module that I did was called Bodies and Entanglements. And the final one was Notes on the Future, Gender, Sexuality, and the Digital Everyday. And I didn't choose which module I was going to facilitate as much as I chose the act of facilitating. It was something that I wanted to do. I felt that this was a place where we could talk with each other, right? And remembering that there was no one in the cohort that I knew before the course, right? So everyone we met during our introductory call, and we were all in different places, different states, different countries for some of us, and coming from very different experiences and very different trainings as well. And I really enjoyed co facilitating and I enjoyed the calls themselves because they were a space of very intentional listening and learning and co creating. And the first time I facilitated, I remember being quite breathless because I had prepared by putting together two prompts or examples to kind of kickstart the discussion. And one of those was quite intimate for me in some ways. And to see that, everyone responded, made connections with my experience and their own, and really brought their own training across technology and design and the humanities and their various experiences to inform their sharings. And we kept building further and further on that. So that was really incredible. And I really valued the space going forward. I also co facilitated the final call we did as a cohort, which really involved bringing an initial question into our space. And I had prepared a couple of additional questions that, okay, these are prompts that we can go to get to further on in the discussion, if need be. And it's really a testament to how deeply we'd become involved with the material and committed to the process of learning collectively that I never ended up bringing out the rest of those prompts because the discussion took on new shapes and forms, and my co-learners brought their own questions and prompts to the space. And so by the final call, we had come to that space. And I think that was really incredible. As far as sharing what prompts or what questions to bring to co-facilitation, I think it was really key to think about just that everyone was coming from a very different experience and coming from a very different kind of training as well. And it's also an act, I think, for me of making myself vulnerable in some ways, which is something that you do when you facilitate or when you teach, right? It's that you bring yourself, all of yourself, to a classroom. And that's the kind of pedagogy I'll get on board with. So it was a really aligned kind of learning space for me.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite parts about TDE was just that the fact that everyone was coming together with such diverse life experiences and backgrounds. I just got to learn so much and think in so many different ways that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. What did you take away from your experience with co facilitation and creating a learning space with your cohort? Do you think it's also influenced other areas of your work?
Yeah. I think there's so many connections to be made across my work and this course in particular. So the content is one, like what we learned is one, and how that's inseparable from really our experience of navigating the material. And I think it was really incredible how we all of us made the course our own by responding to it in our own ways. And I think that really showed how this is a course that trusts its learners. And by placing trust in its learners, it also creates a space where learners trust each other. Learners, co creators of the course, how they trust each other. And I think that's something that I'll keep with me as a really positive kind of act, a really positive kind of pedagogy, a pedagogy that's really aligned with what is, education, as Paulo Freire says, education as the practice of freedom, right? I was reading this book by Miles Horton and Paulo Freire, which is called We Make the Road by Walking. And they both of these educators have a lot in common, working in different contexts, but so aligned, really committed to the same sense of justice and building a world. And they both saw the value in speaking with each other from a place of honesty and reflection to move towards something useful, something powerful, right? Something that gave those who walked with them and after them the tools and the vocabulary to move ahead and to go further than they did. And I see this in my friendships with people who share the same commitments. I see this in many of my colleagues who work in similar spaces. I saw this in this course as well, to emphasize how popular participation is how we change the world, right? And how we need education that's liberatory, that's participatory, that's fundamentally challenging how we order education around us, how we order and how we perceive learning, what we recognize as learning, what we recognize as the learning space.
I think social justice and moving towards a more equitable world really form the core principles of the digital everyday. And in terms of learning spaces, having trust is so important because without that, you can't show up as your whole self and fully open yourself up to growth and change. And that's how real learning happens, in my opinion. Has your relationship with technology changed since you participated in the course?
There are so many things in the sense of my relationship to tech. One experience I can share, Yashita, and that is that very recently at the library I volunteer at now, we had a member tell a story. And that story had a character, and she'd written this story. So I won't tell you all of it, but I will tell you that it had a character who was failing to do other things because he was on his phone and because he was playing games on his phone all the time, and that was kind of consuming all of his time. It's what some people might call, being addicted to gaming or being addicted to the phone. And I think earlier it may have taken me some time to kind of think through it and arrive at how to understand this. And I think after this course, I had the language to be able to identify how there was a very clear systemic issue, which resulted in a lot of us blaming young people for what we see as them making certain choices, right? As relates to technology in particular. And to really shift that blame away from young people and to really look at who's really to be interrogated here. What are the forms of power that are acting, and who are the people and the companies that are actively building this sort of system? And I think after the course, I had the kind of language to be able to identify that and to have a discussion also in our group around issues of technology that weren't limited to accessing technology, but were limited to how technology structures our behavior, how it structures our time.
Definitely. I think it's really eye opening to learn and talk about the socio-political dimensions of technology, how it relates to power structures, and what's actually behind tech design, the systemic and structural effects of technology. And you bringing up this young person's story actually reminds me of my experience attending a workshop conducted at Point of View, where we were speaking to young girls between the ages of 12 to 14 and explaining topics like digital consent, privacy, digital gender norms. And one of the biggest takeaways is that for the younger generation, being online is just such an essential part of their lives and has always been, because they're growing up in this digital age. And it's so important to move the conversation away from blaming them or taking an overly protectionist approach and cautioning them away from tech and saying the mobile phone is bad and being online is bad. And instead, actually just teaching them how to use the internet and social media in a way that's safe and free, and teaches them about these power structures and how tech is designed, because it's something that they can't escape. It's something that's a part of their lives. So, what is something that has stayed with you from this course? What is your favorite memory from it?
Really stays with me from the course is, and it's something that I think everyone can also think about, is this one prompt we were given by Nishant, which was that we were supposed to each find an object that we thought was completely untouched by digital technology, as well as an object that's exclusively only produced by digital technology without any links to the physical world. So, two objects, one that's completely untouched by digital tech, and the other that's only exclusively produced by digital tech. So, that was a really, really interesting and textured activity, not only to do, but to discuss in the cohort, because, of course, everyone kind of brought in the very different experiences and ways of seeing this activity. But also that during our learning call, we really unpacked our processes of selecting and curating such objects. And of course, it's mentioned at the outset that this activity is itself an impossibility in some ways. It's superbly difficult, if not impossible, to find this. But what really stood out for me was when we each brought our objects to the learning call, and say someone brought, someone said, I think a rock at the bottom of the ocean is something that's closest to what I can think of as completely untouched from digital tech, right? So thinking in terms of distance, and then someone brought the idea of, and this was really great, someone actually thought that possibly a ghavar, and then also shared that, I really thought it could be a ghavar, but then I read that you can actually 3D print a ghavar now. Yeah, and that's incredible, because we were really able to share how all of us were challenging ourselves and pushing ourselves to kind of find that. And that was a really incredible session, honestly. And like, someone brought a web page, someone brought a piece of jewelry, someone brought a matka, And so we thought in terms of distance, we thought in terms of power, we thought in terms of, heritage, or in terms of time.
That's so interesting. I had such a tough time with this prompt, and that's really fascinating that you all framed it in terms of thinking about distance. I mean, the person who said that a rock at the bottom of the ocean is closest, I think that's a really great example. I mean, I was thinking as far as maybe a planet that hasn't been discovered yet, that's so far untouched by digital tech. Perhaps that could be an answer. I mean, this question is really something that's deceptively simple, and I love hearing the different creative responses that came out of it. Thank you so much for your time and all your incredible insights, Zoya. You've left us with so much to reflect on, from collective reading as an act of resistance to the importance of trust and honesty in learning spaces, and the importance of being able to be vulnerable in a learning environment. We really appreciated having you. For our listeners, see you all in our next episode.